Welcome. Not many people know this, but many stress-related conditions, from anxiety and depression to digestive issues and autoimmune disease, are significantly more common in women. In some cases, up to 5 times more common in women. All conditions in which the nervous system plays a central role. And when we look more closely at the neurobiology, the biological hardware of the nervous system, an interesting picture is becoming clear. It turns out the female nervous system is different from the male nervous system in some important ways. And that matters because most of what we know about stress, regulation, and resilience comes from research based on male physiology and then assumed to apply equally to females. And if the model is off, then the ways we try to support the system will be off too. Which is why many of the interventions we turn to aren't actually appropriate for women. And when you consider that women are the ones most affected by these issues, you can see why so many women are not getting the support they need. So part of what we're doing here is updating that model, making it more accurate and more relevant to lived female experience. We're going to look at a few key ways the female nervous system differs in how it develops, how it processes information, and how it responds to stress. And importantly, what those differences mean when it comes to healing dysregulation, building capacity, and supporting resilience. Now, this might sound complex, but it's really quite straightforward. You don't need to memorize anything. This is about expanding our perspective and refining the model to better reflect the diversity of female experience in order to make better informed decisions about how to care for ourselves and the women in our lives. Now, before we go any further, let's take a moment to understand what we mean here by dysregulation. It's a term you hear a lot, but all it really means is the system that's meant to keep everything running smoothly and help you respond appropriately to what's happening around you is no longer doing that consistently. The nervous system coordinates all the other systems of the body: the digestive system, the hormonal system, the immune system, the cardiovascular system. It's the overarching system, constantly taking in information, making sense of it, and directing the body's response. In many ways, it's the body's operating system, which means how well it's functioning shapes how well everything else is functioning. So, when it becomes dysregulated, the effects can be wide-ranging, and they don't always look obviously connected. They can show up as brain fog, irritability, trouble sleeping, unexplained pain and tension, and many different manifestations, all tracing back to the same underlying system. If you're recognizing yourself in this, you're not alone. And importantly, these responses are not random. They're the system's best attempt to adapt to stress, given its current capacity and the conditions it's operating in. The first key difference in female nervous systems is in how the brain develops and responds to inflammation. In early development, before birth and in infancy, male and female brains show slightly different developmental trajectories. Male brains tend to grow more rapidly and remain around 10% larger on average, in line with overall body size. But that rapid growth is linked with more inflammation and developmental disruption. Female brains, by contrast, tend to develop more gradually, with greater stability during early development. Shown here on the right is the smaller female brain with less inflammation in red. than in the larger male brain of the same age on the left. Larger brains might seem like an advantage, but what matters more is connectivity, how efficiently different regions communicate. Early on, rapid brain growth and the inflammation that comes with it can place male infants at a distinct disadvantage, and we see a difference in health outcomes. Male babies are more likely to experience developmental complications and have around 10% higher risk of dying before and during birth, and around a 20% higher risk of mortality in their first year of life. Female infants, by contrast, tend to show more stable early development, with more robust connectivity and greater resilience during this critical period. For many boys, this nervous vulnerability carries through into childhood. Many of the neurological conditions that are more common in boys, shown here on the right, emerge in early childhood, likely reflecting this greater vulnerability in the early brain development. The conditions more common in females, on the left, tend to emerge after puberty, and this is where we see a significant shift. Testosterone, which rises rapidly at puberty in males, is a powerful stress modulator. It buffers stress responses and reduces reactivity in the system. One of the ways testosterone exerts this effect is through its interaction with cortisol. Cortisol helps mobilize energy in response to challenge, but when it remains elevated over time, it contributes to dysregulation. Higher testosterone is associated with reduced reactivity of the HPA axis, the body's stress response system, resulting in a smaller cortisol response and faster recovery. By contrast, female physiology, with significantly lower baseline testosterone and fluctuating estrogen, tends to show greater variability in cortisol responses, particularly under chronic stress. This has important implications for how we work with the nervous system. Many popular nervous system practices work by deliberately spiking adrenaline and cortisol. And while these can be beneficial for some individuals, they are generally much better tolerated and therefore much more useful for male physiology. In women, particularly those already experiencing dysregulation, these approaches can push an already sensitized system further into activation. So instead of helping the system regulate and settle, they can sometimes make symptoms worse. Estrogen, which is relatively higher in females, increases sensitivity to environmental and social cues and fluctuates across the cycle. So from puberty onwards, the female system tends to become more responsive, more stress sensitive, and more variable in its stress responses. And as we move through adolescence and into adulthood, we start to see higher rates in females of conditions linked to chronic stress and dysregulation, including anxiety, depression, eating disorders, and PTSD. So, across the lifespan, a clear pattern emerges. Greater nervous vulnerability early on in males, and greater nervous vulnerability later on in females. This is the trade-off. Females enjoy greater stability and survival rates early on, but increased stress sensitivity and occurrence of dysregulation and all of its wide-ranging effects later in life. What we are observing is not a flaw, it's a different biological strategy. We'll return to this idea. The second key difference is in how the brain is wired. On average, male brains, like the two at the top here, tend to show stronger connectivity within each hemisphere, whereas female brains, like the two at the bottom here, tend to show stronger connectivity between the two hemispheres. So rather than processing being more localized, there is more cross-communication across different regions of the brain. This supports integration between emotional, social, and cognitive processing, which can be a real strength. It allows for greater attunement, greater sensitivity to social cues, and a more holistic way of processing experience. But it also changes how information moves through the system. When something stressful happens, it doesn't naturally stay so contained, compartmentalized. It tends to spread more widely across multiple subsystems at once. So instead of a stressor being processed in a more isolated way, it can become emotional, cognitive, and physiological all at the same time. And that can make experiences feel more intense and more complex, incorporating multiple domains of experience, and therefore more easily entrenched and harder to switch off. There is also an energetic cost. Maintaining this level of integration requires more coordination across the system, more communication between regions, and more ongoing regulation, which can increase the overall load the system is carrying over time. So, we're looking at a different configuration, one that supports deep integration and connection, but that comes with a higher baseline demand on the system's resources, which becomes especially relevant under sustained pressure. The third key difference is in how the system responds to stress. Most people are familiar with the idea of fight or flight, but research suggests that the female stress response often favours another mode, sometimes described as tend and befriend. Instead of moving directly into confrontation or withdrawal, the system moves towards connection, creating safety through attunement, cooperation, and care. One way to think about this difference is that male systems are more likely to externalize stress through action, confrontation, or withdrawal, whereas female systems are more likely to internalize stress, seek resolution within, or via co-regulation with another, or else hold on to it. Over time, that internalization can show up not just as emotional strain, but as dysregulation and physical symptoms. This pattern is closely linked to the tend and befriend response, a stress response shaped by oxytocin, which is more readily recruited in women, and by a heightened sensitivity to social and environmental cues. And none of this is accidental. From an evolutionary perspective, this configuration serves a purpose. Across history, the female nervous system was not optimized for individual survival. It was optimized for the joint survival of mother and infant. And that prioritization has consequences for women as individuals. On average, women score higher than men on traits like agreeableness and emotional sensitivity. These traits support bonding, empathy, and caregiving, essential for keeping a vulnerable infant alive. But they can also make women more prone to over-accommodating others, people-pleasing, neglecting their own needs. At a population level, we also see different patterns in how stress and social behaviour are expressed. Men are more likely, on average, to score higher on traits associated with dominance and emotional distance, whereas women are more likely to be highly attuned to others' perceptions and more affected by the need for approval and social harmony. And while that attunement supports connection and society at large, it can also create a constant background load, constantly monitoring, adjusting, anticipating, which becomes difficult to sustain over time. So the stress isn't always expressed outwardly, but it is still very much present in the system. It may also make the system more vulnerable to the pressures of modern life. The female nervous system evolved for connection, cooperation, and caregiving in rich but relatively stable social environments. But modern life places it in a constant stream of stimulation, urban, digital, and social, far removed from the conditions it evolved to thrive in. With its strong capacity for social processing, under stress, the female system often turns to talking, discussing problems, analysing events. In the right context, with the right constraints, this can be helpful. But when it becomes repetitive, compulsive, or open-ended, it becomes what's called co-rumination, where discussing your distress with others actually amplifies and entrenches it, rather than helping to resolve it. In the nervous system, repeated activation of stress circuits means the brain rehearses patterns of vigilance and distress. And what it rehearses, it strengthens. Those networks are reinforced, and over time, they become more dominant. That's neuroplasticity, the brain changing in response to experience. And in a system that adapts more readily, those patterns are learned and reinforced more easily. So over time, the system begins to organise around these patterns because at some level, they create a sense of familiarity, of connection and safety. And there's another potential problem. When regulation becomes overly dependent on others, it reduces autonomy and the capacity for self-regulation, essential functions of a well-regulated nervous system. If our state becomes too closely tethered to others, who may have different needs, priorities, or levels of awareness, the system can never fully settle. Instead, it can remain in a state of ongoing activation, constantly adjusting, anticipating, and adapting, creating a subtle but sustained strain on the system. And over time, that becomes exhausting. But this doesn't mean connection is the problem. It highlights something important. When regulation happens readily in connection, who we connect with and how really matters. When that connection is safe, supportive, and aligned, it becomes a powerful pathway for regulation and healing. So, when you bring all of this together, a system that is more sensitive, more interconnected, and more oriented toward connection, you don't have a weaker system. You have a system that is more responsive, more dynamic, and therefore more affected by circumstances, and especially by sustained stress. So the system doesn't just respond to stress in the moment, it carries more of it forward. When we zoom out to the population level, the pattern becomes clearer. It's important to note there is wide variation among individuals, with significant overlap between the sexes. but women account for roughly 2/3 of clinical presentations of nervous system related disorders, while men account for around 1/3, and women represent the majority of severe cases. There are notable exceptions. Severe depression and severe PTSD occur in men at roughly similar rates. But overall, across the population, women are disproportionately affected by more severe and more chronic patterns of dysregulation, often manifesting as stress-related conditions. And at any given time, around 1 in 4 people meet the criteria for a diagnosable mental health condition, many of which are closely linked to underlying nervous system dysregulation. Which means this is not a rare issue. It's a widespread, population-level problem. So, what does this actually look like in real life? All of us experience stress. That's normal and healthy. The nervous system is designed to move in and out of activation. The problem arises when stress becomes chronic and the system doesn't get the opportunity to fully reset. Over time, that load accumulates, especially in a system that is both highly responsive and highly adaptive. And as it accumulates, the body tends to give us warning signals in the form of feelings and symptoms. Feelings like fatigue, or feeling wired but tired, difficulty focusing, sleep disturbance, physical tension and pain, various expressions of dysregulation in the nervous system. And if these signals are ignored, dysregulation can become ingrained, leading over time to more persistent conditions like chronic anxiety, digestive disorders, and autoimmune disease. And once patterns like this do become ingrained, it doesn't mean there's nothing more to be done. On the contrary, it makes it even more important to tend to the system, to support it in restoring balance and health as much as possible. When women first learn how their nervous systems differ from the standard model, there's often a moment of relief, a sense of things beginning to make a little more sense. Because so many of us have spent years believing something is wrong with us, that we are too sensitive, too emotional, too reactive. But what I observe is a nervous system that has been asked to operate in conditions it was never designed for. And once we understand that, an important question arises. If the nervous system can become dysregulated, can it also become regulated again? And the answer is yes, because the same plasticity that allows these patterns to form also makes them possible to change. Which brings us to an important idea. Nervous system healing happens across 4 levels: physiological, somatic, emotional, and cognitive. You can think of the nervous system like a house. The physiological level is the foundations and the brickwork of the house. If this layer is not strong, everything above it becomes unstable. The somatic level is how we inhabit the space, our posture, our breathing, our muscle tone, our movement. It's how the body expresses and organizes itself moment to moment. The emotional level is the atmosphere of the house, the felt sense of the space. Is it calm, tense, heavy, or warm? This is what we're living in, the air we're breathing, often without even realizing it. And the cognitive level is the view from the roof, the stories we tell ourselves, our beliefs, our interpretations, our meaning making. It shapes how we see the world and what we think is possible. Most modern approaches focus heavily on the top levels and ignore the lower levels. But if the foundations are unstable, everything above is unsteady. Sustainable healing requires working across all 4 levels. And when you work with the system in this way, things that once felt stuck often begin to shift surprisingly quickly. When people first begin working on their nervous system, it can feel overwhelming. There are hundreds of techniques and a lot of conflicting advice, much of it misinformed and male-oriented. But what we need to recognize first of all is that dysregulation isn't a single problem. It's a cluster. And once you understand your system's patterns, the path back to regulation becomes clearer. This is the roadmap I've developed through working with clients. Dysregulation shows up in 3 key ways: disorganization, reduced capacity, and reduced resilience. To make these a little more clear, I like to use the metaphor of a bowl of water. First, disorganization. This is when the system isn't working in a coordinated way. In the metaphor, the bowl is wobbly or leaking. So even if what's coming in is manageable, it doesn't stay contained. This often shows up in the nervous system as too much or too little energy. For example, hypervigilance, restlessness, overthinking, or else fatigue, lethargy, apathy, shutdown. And because the nervous system regulates the whole body, it can also disrupt sleep, digestion, immune function, and sensitivity to the environment. Second, reduced capacity. This is the size of the bowl, how much stress, stimulation, or emotion the system can hold before tipping into overwhelm. If the system is carrying accumulated load, there's simply less room left in the bowl. When capacity is reduced, it doesn't take much, a busy day, a difficult conversation, to push the system beyond what it can comfortably cope with. This shows up in the nervous system as heightened sensitivity to light, sound, touch, smell, or other triggers, and as emotional volatility, irritability, mood swings, and feeling easily overwhelmed. And third, reduced resilience. This is the strength and integrity of the bowl itself, how well it can withstand the bigger shocks and losses of life. And when the system is already carrying a lot, or when previous knocks haven't fully healed yet, it takes less to fracture it and longer to recover. When resilience is low, it takes less to be affected by outside events and longer to return to balance. So when something difficult happens, it feels more intense, the effects are more wide-ranging, and recovery takes longer. So it's not just what you're holding, it's how steady the bowl is, how much it can hold, and whether it holds or cracks when life hits. And the work then is to gradually shift the system toward better organisation, greater capacity, and restored resilience. As you can probably sense, this isn't about fixing one symptom. It's about working with the system as a whole, gradually reorganising it, increasing its capacity, and restoring resilience. And that's a complete process that becomes much easier with the right structure and the right support. And this is where most people get stuck. Not because change isn't possible, but because they don't have the right structure and support to follow through and complete the process. This is why I created my group program, where we move through the process together, step by step, working across the physiological, somatic, emotional, and cognitive levels, to give your system the conditions it needs to thrive again. And because the nervous system is built to learn and adapt, change is absolutely possible, often much more quickly than you might expect. So, if this sounds like something you could benefit from, you're very welcome to join us. The next course starts soon, but you can access the material straight away. Begin at your own pace and get ahead before we start together. I hope this has given you a clearer understanding of your nervous system and a better sense of what it needs from you. If you found this helpful, please like, subscribe, and share it with anyone who might benefit. Thank you.